Hi everyone, welcome to my first demo for 2023. In this demo I'd like to explore the idea of having pieces that are somewhat interactive. I've had this idea before with some blocks that you could mix up and change their orientation and play with it to have a different look for every day or every month or whenever you want to change it. In this case I wanted to be able to insert a piece within a piece. The idea is if I'm making round artwork and I keep the hole in the center the same size, then every smaller piece that I make to insert into the bigger piece will be interchangeable with every other piece I've made with the same hole size. In this demo you'll see me make three large textured pieces, and two small textured pieces that fit into the larger pieces. I wanted to make three of each, but I've just run out of time, so I'm putting this together. So this demo is somewhat of a proof of concept. I've never made this before. It was just an idea that I had. Previously I had laid pieces on top of other pieces, but never had them standing up. I wasn't sure how to attach them or keep them together or be able to mix them up with other pieces. But in this demo you'll see that I've created a few larger pieces and then a few smaller pieces. The smaller pieces have spindles on the back which fit into the whole of the larger pieces. Anyway, you get the idea. If you have any questions, let me know and I'll answer them as best as I can. Enjoy the show and let me know what you think. So for the start of this video I'm just going to show you my process from how I start from a blank piece of timber or a rough cut piece of timber to cutting it out and putting it on the lathe to turn. The bandsaw is a pretty easy option for cutting things out, but if you haven't got a bandsaw you can just use a chainsaw or a handsaw just to cut off those corners. Here you can see me opening up the chuck to its maximum width so I can measure it. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to make the tenon as big as possible, because as you'll see later in the end of this part of the video, I'm going to drill a hole all the way through to the other side. I always like doing this face cleanup work. It's kind of satisfying. For all of this demo I'll be making a few pieces and they'll all be made from jacaranda timber. I find my timber from fallen trees, or sometimes people cut them down in their backyard and I find them listed online. Usually they're still whole trees and I get to cut them up to whatever size I need. Generally these days, doing more sort of sculptural and thinner pieces, I cut them to about 2 or 3 inches thick and therefore they dry a bit quicker in my sort of outdoor kiln shed. That's just the way I do it now. I don't turn too many bowls, so this is a bit easier, unless of course I want to turn a bowl and I can't find a thick enough piece. I'm just doing a rough cut on this edge for the moment. I'll clean it up when I turn it around. Here I'm using my trusty Skilton sander that I've had for years and years. It may have a new head on it though. I don't think it's the original head. Well worth the money though. So this is my preferred bowl gouge. It's just a 1/2 inch P&N I think, with a custom handle. I pretty much use this bowl gouge for everything. I might have a couple more but I use them rarely. I actually still use some of the tools I got when I first got a lathe. I think they're Tulex, something like that. Not great steel, but they do the job. Still do the job. If anyone would like to know, I actually use ceramic coated sandpaper. So this edge I'm actually going to hollow out a bit so it's sort of concave, so it's higher on the outside. That way when you stand it up, it stands on the two edges and doesn't fall over the two outside edges it'll stand on. Here you can see the gap underneath the middle of the level, and it's actually sitting on the two outside edges. That's how I gauge that it's done correctly and that it actually will sit level. Now to drilling a hole through the middle. I'm just using a regular Forstner bit. Well, when I mean regular, I mean a good quality Forstner bit. I've bought a few poor quality Forstner bits in my time, and eventually I end up coughing up the money and buying a good set of Carbitool bits, which are a million times better. As you can see, it fell out of this cheap chuck. I recommend getting a much better chuck, like a keyless chuck, that I actually have on my drill press. Works a lot better and is a lot easier to use. Now I've finished that, I'm going to take it off the lathe for texturing, and I'm going to use my Woodcut Pro mount. I received this recently, and it's really good, and makes life a lot easier when texturing. Previously I'd just been doing it on the workbench or on a box on the workbench, and this is just a lot easier. This first texture I'm going to do with a floppy disk, just an ordinary cheap $5 floppy disk. When I say ordinary, I mean I did modify it slightly so that it's sort of angled to a point. So I just just used a piece of concrete just to give it the angle, so it gave a sharper edge. You can use any grit you like with the floppy disks. It doesn't really matter, and they last a long time. They're kind of not completely solid, so they are flexible, which actually gives a kind of a nice smooth finish. They do burn a bit though, but that's okay for my use because I tend to stain or paint things most of the time anyway. With this close-up you can see a little bit of the burning, but it's not a great amount. If you had a coarser disc, then it wouldn't burn as much as a finer disc. I generally use a medium disc, maybe around about an 80 grit or 100 grit, something like that. As I say, if you go too fine, it just burns a lot, and it just wears out, I suppose, a bit faster, or gets clogged easier as well. Despite the actual size of the grinder and the disc, you can actually do quite delicate movements and quite delicate carving with it. I've done a lot of carving using the flap disc, and I highly recommend it. Practice makes perfect, of course. Make sure you practice as much as you can and do some practice just before you do your main piece. I practiced before I started this, just I haven't done it for possibly a couple of months. Everyone always asks me what type of grinder I use. I actually use the Blue Grinder. It works very well, and you do get what you pay for. Again, I did see a video on YouTube once where a guy pulled apart some grinders and found that the Makita was better built than a lot of the others. This whole texturing process for this piece probably took me about 20 minutes, something like that. I would have done some touch-ups after this short clip's finished as well. I'll have a good look over it and make sure everything's okay, and add some bits and pieces every now and then just to fill the vacant spaces. It's sort of best, I think, to not leave a lot of space between the texturing. Keep it as tight as possible, which you'll see in some of the carbide burr texturing I'll do further along in this video. You can see me here just filling some of the little spaces that I missed, or just giving a bit more character to the texture. There's no rhyme or reason the way I do it, I just do it as I go along. Try not to think about it too much. I actually think I have about 7 or 8 grinders, different brands and models. I use all of them. Some of them have dedicated discs attached to them, like the Sabur discs. I just leave them on there constantly. Generally, though, the ones that I leave on all the time are on a sort of a medium quality grinder. I don't buy any of the really cheap grinders anymore. You could buy $30 grinders or something around that in Australia, but they tend to not last very long anyway. So I don't recommend cheap grinders at all. I actually skipped the filming of the painting process for this piece. I did start to film it, and because I'm using like a spray paint, or it's actually an acrylic spray paint, it just went everywhere, all over the camera. So I quickly stopped spraying and just did it off camera. I actually used Liquitex acrylic spray for this piece. Titanium white is the color, I believe. I think it's about $17 or $20 per can. But they do last for a few pieces, so it works out to be about $5 per piece. So here I'm using a skew chisel to create a bit of a bevel on the inside of the hole. Just working it backwards and forwards very lightly to create a nice smooth finish that should need a lot of sanding. I usually start at 120 grit, then 180, then 240, then 400, 800, 1600. They're the main grits I use for pretty much everything, although this one I just put a little bit of 240 and 400 just to finish it off, and 400 on the inside of the hole there. Now that it's off the lathe, I'm using my good old trusty flap disc to remove as much of the tenon as I can, being careful not to take off too much. Then I'll just use a regular orbital sander, in this case it's my Metabo that I've had for a long time, just to make sure it's all sort of flat and smooth and blends into the rest of the piece, which I previously sanded on the lathe. Then once I've done this, I blow off as much dust as I can, and then I give it a light coat of artist spray, usually a matte artist spray. This sort of gives it a bit of protection so it doesn't get dirty and things like that. And of course, here is the final completed piece. To finish this section off, I thought I'd show you a few textures you can create with the floppy disk. Sometimes I just spend a bit of time in the garage on the weekends or the evenings and just pick a tool and just create textures. Lots of experimentation leads to good ideas and practice. As mentioned earlier, the flap disk can create nice, smooth, curved textures. It can be a little bit hard to control, and you will kind of mess it up a little bit, but it's not really messing it up, it's just adding a bit of character, and textures don't always have to be perfect. So these are just a few ideas I had after creating the last piece. I had a spare 10 minutes or so, I thought I'd put together a few ideas. None of these I think are terribly outstanding, but they may lead to another idea in the future. The flap disc lends itself well to line designs, as you can see what I'm doing here. The one in the middle there didn't quite work out, looks a bit messy. As mentioned, it can be quite a delicate tool to use, and as you can see, using the flap disc and the grinder I can stay between the lines pretty good. You don't always have to create lines here, you can sort of carve into the wood, sort of like a bird disc I suppose, and create different textures. In a minute I'll turn this sort of sideways so you can see what it actually looks like when you have the light coming across in the correct or a certain way. In this section of the video, I'll show you how I create the piece that inserts into the bigger piece. It's not terribly hard to do, you just have to creep up on the actual spindle size that fits into the hole, otherwise it may be too loose or too tight. I'm using a thicker piece of timber for this as I want to make it a one-piece piece. The other version is you could do a normal sized piece and then glue on the spindle on the back so it can be inserted into the larger piece of art. As I mentioned, slowly creep up on the size of the spindle you need to have, and I use measuring calipers to make sure I get as close as I can. In this case I was looking for about 40 millimeters of spindle length. This would actually protrude from the back of the piece slightly, but I'll give the back of the spindle a slight bevel so it sort of looks right. If it's slightly longer, it means it might suit other pieces I make in the future. Here you can see I've moved on to a spindle gouge. This is what I'll use to fine tune the size of the spindle. Pretty much all of these pieces will have a concave front and a concave back. This is sort of something I've been doing for a while now, but in this case it actually allows the piece to be flatter, I suppose. These centre pieces are determined to be about 10 millimeters thick. Any sort of thicker than that, they didn't kind of look right, and any thinner than that, they're just a bit thin and they could warp over time. So 10 mil is what I chose for this. Here I am making the concave front. The depth of this compared to the outside is about 5 millimeters thinner in the middle. Other pieces range from about 10 to 20 mil thinner in the middle. It's important to get the sanding perfect without any flaws. If there's any flaws, you'll see them between the textures if you don't get the textures tight enough. So I've actually created 3 lines this time. This way I can see how far I'm creeping in, or in this case creeping out with the hole in the bevel. It's also there for the textures, so I can go over the first line but not the second line. The first tool I'm using here is a brown carbide burr. As you can see, I've got a little picture of it there. These are the first texturing tools I ever used. I think I bought some off eBay for pretty cheap, and they've lasted quite a long time. They are designed to be grinding metal with, so wood is no problem for them. You do sort of again get what you pay for. Don't get the most cheapest ones or the most expensive. Somewhere in the middle will give you a decent quality bit. I find that when I'm making texture, it works best to have each texture overlap the other texture, so there's actual no space in between them. You might see me go over the same area again and just hit little spots that I might have missed where there is a bit of a gap, but generally I try and keep it as tight as possible. Also with this one I'm starting with a small burr, and then I'll increase the size as we go towards the outside edges. I've just moved to my die grinder just then with a bigger burr. As you can see, it's not burning as much as the little one, and the depth is controlled by how much I press it into the wood. This whole piece probably took me about half an hour, 40 minutes or something like that to complete. You do need lots of rest when using the die grinder because it's kind of heavy. The small rotary tools with the smaller burrs are the best to get started. It's cheap and the little rotary tools are cheap and you get just as good results. But you are limited to smaller pieces unless you want to make really fine textures on larger pieces, of course. With the outside, with this texture, I try not to get near the edges. If you go near the edges, it sort of ruins the outside line and it gives a bit of a funny look. Once again, I didn't film the painting of this one. I used this acrylic spray can and I didn't want to ruin my equipment, so I just didn't record it. But you get the idea, paint in the can. I do use a fair bit of acrylic paint, and a lot of people ask me what brands to use or what type of paints I use. A lot of them think I'm using like milk paint or chalk paint, but I've tried those and they don't work as well. They tend to sit in the holes and clog them up, whereas acrylic paint's kind of a little bit stretchy or sticky, so you can pull out of the holes so it doesn't fill them up and make it look all mushy. So you can try them all. You might prefer the other ones, but I prefer acrylic paint. No particular brands. I just get whatever's available, but I don't get anything too cheap. Generally, a more expensive white paint will be better than a cheaper white paint just for the amount of pigment that's actually in it. So I'm just using the skew chisel again to create that inside bevel and using the very corner of the skew chisel to create some lines. And that's the piece complete. This time I'm going to make a piece that has rings, and within each ring is going to be a different texture. Once I've done the texturing and the painting, I'm going to sand back some of the rim and middle center sections to reveal the wood behind it to give a bit of contrast to the paints that I've used. I did use a pencil to accurately measure this out, which I don't normally do. I don't normally measure anything. But as you can see, I had to make a small change anyway. My measurements didn't quite work, or I didn't quite think it looked right. I usually judge everything by eye. As I say, I don't measure anything usually. I'm using my round nose scraper this time. I'm just taking tiny little cuts from the inside out to create the concave rings. This is one of the tools that I originally purchased with my lathe. It's not a high quality tool at all, but it does the job. Might need sharpening a bit more than other tools, but I don't use it that much, so it's not worthwhile purchasing a really good one. So just working my way from the center outwards, you do have to be very careful as to not get a catch. The high points of the rings can chip a little bit depending what timber you're using. The outside of this piece also has like a concave The outer edge of this piece, like the previous one, does have a concave profile. So it sits on the two outside edges, has the gap in the middle where in that way it'll stand up on its own on the two outside edges and not fall over. Once I've done my first pass from the inside out, I'll go over it again and just clean it up with some smaller, lighter cuts. I'm also making sure that the rings are equal sizes as best I can. As I said, I don't measure, I sort of just do it by eye, and it generally turns out pretty good. The very outside edge and the very inside edge I'm leaving flat. This way, later on, I can sand up the high points to add a bit of contrast to the piece. I'm just using a little bit of sandpaper to clean it up. The round nose scraper did a pretty good job at making it nice and smooth, but a little sandpaper doesn't hurt. Of course, we're going to fill the rings with texture. It's not that important to sand it super well. It's probably more important up near the top of the rings where there might be a gap where the wood meets the texture, well, where I can't texture high enough. So here I am starting the texture on the outside rim using a larger burr in a die grinder. I usually texture the inside and the outside of each ring first and then fill in the middle. I'm always careful to try and keep it as tight as possible and not to go too far up the edge of the ring, otherwise it'll make a dent in the top and it'll look funny. I think this piece took me around about 2 hours to finish the texturing. I usually take lots of breaks. Taking lots of breaks keeps you fresh and it helps you not to make too many mistakes. I'm going to use the round carbide burr again, but in a different way. This time I'll be using it to create lines from the center to the outside. This is probably one of the harder textures you can do. It's very easy to mess up and it takes a lot of concentration to get them straight. As I said, it's very easy to mess up. As you're doing each stroke, if you start too high or end too high, you'll mess up the ring. If I haven't done this in a while, I'll take it very slowly, doing nice light strokes and taking my time with lots of breaks. You may not notice, but as I get through this texture on this particular ring, I actually speed up a little bit just from getting used to the movements and more confident in what I'm doing. It does leave a little bit of burr sometimes, as you can see the one I just did, but we can clean this up later, so don't feel the need to remove the burr as you go along. You also need to find the right size bit. A too small a bit and a too big a bit is actually harder. Just before I started the texturing, you'll notice that I used a ruler to create some lines. This creates sections and I work on one section at a time, and I'm always dividing, so in half, then in quarters, then in eighths, and then just fill in the remaining pieces. As an alternative to this round carbide bit, you could use a round burr bit instead. this would be a little bit trickier and create some weird lines, but you can go over it again just by touching it lightly to create a texture within the texture. You'll see this in one of the upcoming pieces in this video. A good alternative to using a round carbide bit is to use a ball-nosed carbide bit. This creates a texture that's not quite round, and I think it looks a lot better in some circumstances. Give it a try, let me know what you think. For this ring, I'm going to use a conical shaped carbide bit. Once again, it's one out of the set I bought many years ago. I'm going to create the texture long ways. You can also do it short ways, but in this case it wouldn't work as well because of the shape of the rings or the concave in the rings. Using this conical carbide burr in this way, doing the texture in long ways around the piece, takes a very long time to do. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is how I get rid of the burrs. As you're texturing it, can lift the fibers on the outside of each of the textures, and the way you can get rid of these is firstly perhaps with something like an eraser or a rubber, and the second way is you can just sort of use your finger or like a brush, and thirdly, the best way I've found so far is just using a piece of fine steel wool, and you just rub it in a circular motion or a cross motion or anti-clockwise rotation, and that should remove most of the burrs. Using sandpaper isn't a good idea because it dulls the edges, it flattens the edges, and your texture doesn't have enough depth then, and it just looks a bit not as good as using the steel wool. In this close-up you can see the little burrs on the edges of the texture, and in a moment I'll bring in the steel wool and clean it up. Once again, I've painted it off camera, although this time I didn't use the spray, I just used regular acrylic out of a tube, and in this color is called Mars Black. It's kind of my favorite black there is, really. The rotary sander does a really good job at removing the paint off the piece. At the moment I'm just using a little bit of sandpaper folded in thirds, and then just taking my time to not take too much off the ridge points. Just little bits at a time so I don't go too far. This pink looking sandpaper I'm using at the moment is that ceramic coated sandpaper I mentioned before. It lasts a lot longer and it doesn't get clogged, and it has the fiber backing, so it's really strong. Once again, this is showing how I remove the tenon with a flap disc and a regular sander. It's just an example, but this is how I do it. And this is the final piece.